you. Thank you very much indeed, and welcome everyone to this Milken Institute panel, which I've been asked to chair on one of the hot topics of the moment around populism. Is it a passing fad or a new political era? We have a very distinguished panel of people to help me discuss this topic. I'm going to be giving you a brief introduction, about 10 minutes or so, and then I'm going to be moderating the discussion between the people that we have on the panel. There is Matthew Elliott on my far right, who is a senior fellow at Legatum Institute, but it was also the successful chief executive of the Leave campaign in the UK. Pass swiftly on. So that would be one very interesting topic, obviously, for us. And then to my immediate right is Jason Furman, who was chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors for President Obama, and is now a senior fellow at the Peterson Institute. Then on my immediate left is, let me make sure Luis, I pronounce your name right. It's Luis Madrazo.
Perfect.
I thought there was a further part of it. Lajous.
That one's in French, so let's leave it at that.
Okay, well, there you are. Anyway, I'm going to play it safe by calling him Luis, who is the chief economist in the Ministry of Finance in Mexico, and will give us a perspective from Mexico, and also a perspective from, if you like, more the developing world. And then there is Yascha Mounk, who is a professor at Harvard, and now actually is working with me on the Institute for Global Change, and has written very extensively on liberal democracy, how we defend it and what it means. So I'm going to give you initial thoughts, and I do so, by the way, with an obvious disclaimer that this is one of the biggest political issues of our time, and people have got very different views. So what happens, what you're about to get now is a very personal perspective. I mean, first off, let's define populism, because it certainly shouldn't be defined as policies which offend the political elite. I remember people accusing me of populism when I introduced tough measures on crime to help poor neighborhoods struggling with drug dealers, gangs, and antisocial behavior, and I always resented the accusation. I was merely responding to genuine concerns with a genuine attempt to rectify them. And by the way, there's nothing wrong with a policy being popular. Populism, for me, is where a politician rides an issue which is sensitive for effect, and in doing so deliberately divides people to create political traction. I would characterize this as whipping up the anger rather than providing the answer. Immigration is the most common issue exploited in this way. In the populist movement sweeping Western politics today, the right will use immigration, the left often anti-business rhetoric. But of course, they can only do this because there is a real problem which exists and which sufficient numbers of the people think is being ignored by their leaders. The chief characteristic, in my view, of the world today is the scope, scale, and speed of change. And as change is accelerated, so have its consequences. Communities and people can be left behind. They can see their local environment changed around them culturally through immigration, and economically through enhanced global competition, trade, and technology. But globalization is not a force driven ultimately by governments, but by people, by technology, travel, and the world opening up. In macro terms, the benefits have been huge. We have, over the past decades, seen more people lifted out of poverty at a faster rate than at any point in time in human history. But especially in the West, globalization has created winners and losers and stresses, both economic and cultural. And part of the cultural divide is between the metropolitans and those outside the big cities. The former seem to the latter to be arrogant, indifferent to their anxieties, and gripped by political correctness. I would say that social media is itself a revolutionary phenomenon. spurring both the visibility of these changes and the capacity to protest about them, and transforming politics by allowing new political movements to flourish at a fraction of the time they took to build in yesteryear, the old days being roughly a decade ago. There is another stimulator, however, of populist revolt, in my view. The feeling that the present political systems just don't deliver. I know people who voted for Donald Trump, despite all the things he said, because they thought he would get things moving, that he would break through the Washington paralysis. I believe this sense of frustration also drives the curious Western dalliance with President Putin, something you find on both the left and right of the spectrum, with the appeal of the strongman leader. This, however, conceals what is a big difference within the new populism between those who believe getting things moving requires deregulation and less government, and those who actually want a more active government, but one doing different things. Anyway, beyond argument, conventional Western politics is under something of a siege. And how to respond is the question. There are few fence-sitters in this debate, and therefore what follows is a personal view. I think this populism is dangerous, but the only response which works is to accept that many of the concerns propelling it are reasonable and have to be addressed by mainstream politics, or the populism will grow. The core of any response should be to provide answers to the anger, real practical policy solutions. So immigration requires rules properly enforced, otherwise those indulging prejudice will win. Communities need effective intervention when undergoing change, which will mean active government support. Education and infrastructure become critical and need reform much more far-reaching and transformative than what is presently offered. And social mobility and the chance to escape poverty and prosper, whatever the wealth of your parents, has to be re-engineered for this generation in the way that was done for my father's and my own. We need tax reform to ensure a more equitable distribution of responsibility and resources. And the role of technology will be vital, both because it presents challenges and also because it presents transformational opportunities. In other words, in my view, the answer to this populism is solutions which are radical and change-making, but still sensible and evidence-based. This approach, which involves the hard business of governing as opposed to campaigning, is what will finally drive back the populist tide. Hoping this tide will subside of its own accord, or treating supporters of the new politics as deluded or ignorant, that for sure won't work. But my final thought is this: does the way in which our mainstream political parties are constituted enable this practical solutions approach to populism? Part of the problem is that the very terminology of traditional left and right doesn't fit the way the world is today, or people are. Even terms like conservative and progressive, when applied to existing parties, can fail to take account of the breakdown in traditional allegiances and the magpie picking of ideas which mark contemporary Western politics. New coalitions today are evolving which cross traditional political boundaries. And here's a paradox. The populist movements are very often very divisive in their politics. Yet one undoubted powerful sentiment the Western world over is the desire for people to put aside partisan difference in the interests of the nation. What we find, both sides of the Atlantic, is that party politics is becoming more partisan than ever, and is assisted by a media which itself is pursuing an agenda for commercial survival based on sharpening such partisanship. So I end with a prediction. The populism will not swiftly disappear because it's based on genuine concerns which the political class have ignored. But it will finally pass when conventional politics is reshaped better to correspond to the 21st century alliance as possible with changing times. Open versus closed could become a more relevant distinction. Those who see globalization as an opportunity whose risks should be mitigated against those who believe it brings more harm than good. If politics fails to respond in this way, then this wave of populism may be the beginning, and the next wave could be much more alarming. However, as always the optimist, I remain confident that conventional politics can respond, provided that it ceases to operate conventionally. Thank you very much. Right, so those are a few of my thoughts to throw out for you guys. Let's go from right to left. Matthew, let's start with you. Passing Fad, New Political Era. What lessons do you learn also out of the Brexit campaign in the UK?
I think it definitely is a new political era. And if you look at sort of British post-war politics, of course you have the post-war consensus defined by Attlee and the creation of the NHS and the welfare state. Then Thatcher came along in the late 70s, early 80s. And this week, of course, marks the 20th anniversary of your election as Prime Minister in 1997. And I think that marked the start of another era, the sort of third way. I was at the LSE at the time, so I remember listening to Anthony Giddens talking about the third way and Bill Clinton coming along and Gerhard Schroeder. And I think you really define the era from that point forward. And everybody from Gordon Brown through to David Cameron were really sort of following in your wake. But I think at the same time, certain concerns from people were being ignored. And this is one of the key factors behind Brexit. I think there was a growth in demand for a referendum. I think people felt that the EU project had gone beyond what it had a democratic mandate for in the UK. There were clearly concerns about migration. I think the numbers of EU migrants coming to the UK were far higher than people thought they would be. And I think all of this culminated in a feeling that the EU wasn't working for the UK. And then, of course, you had the financial crisis added into the whole mix, where the 10 years since the financial crisis, people felt that they'd use their own taxpayers' money to bail out the banks, but then their incomes hadn't started to rise, and in certain sectors they felt that public services weren't working for them and the government weren't providing new homes for them. And all of this culminated in a bit of an anti-establishment feeling, which was the key driver, I think, behind the Leave vote.
I mean, let me just ask you one question, because I think this is one very interesting thing to me about this new politics. To what extent is it driven, as it were, by protest and anxieties over many of the things that you have just articulated? And to what extent is it driven by, as it were, a positive, different way forward? You see what I'm trying to get at there?
I think there were two strands to the Leave vote, which people often forget. Of course, you had the UKIP and Nigel Farage, who had never gone above 30% in any poll, any European poll. And of course, we came along at VoteLeave and produced a very different set of politicians, separate to the UKIP camp, having lots of battles during the referendum with them and lots of fights. But I think we represented with Boris Johnson and Michael Gove and business people like James Dyson and Anthony Bamford, even Gisela Stewart, who sat on the European Convention for you back in the early 2000s. A very different set of politicians. People who felt the EU wasn't working for the UK, felt that the UK was now constrained within a protectionist trade bloc, wanted Britain to have a more international global vision, felt that too many decisions were being made in Brussels rather than the UK. So that was very different. And of course, the two blocs combined added up to 52%.
Yeah. Thank you. Jason, I mean, obviously, you had a front row seat of the last administration. I mean, were you surprised at the result, and what do you think drove the result here? And to what degree do you think this, I mean, how would you answer the question? Is it a fad, or is it something that means that we have to change our frame of looking at politics?
So first of all, thank you for those opening comments. I thought that was the most concise and effective articulation of the type of economic strategy that we need to be pursuing in the United States, the UK, and all of our countries that I've heard. So I would vote for you for anything I'd be legally allowed to vote for you for, which might be
very kind.
a null set. The one thing you would not be able to be is a U.S. senator, because you said you were going to speak for 10 minutes, and then you actually did. Disqualify you.
Yeah, I'm out of practice.
So in terms of the election, I mean, like everyone else, I was surprised by the election. Like everyone else, I tend to think the issues I work on are the most important and the most exciting, and thus the entire world revolves around them. So I'm tempted to think that this was an election about the economy. But I'm not sure about that. When you look at the evidence for the United States, consumers were very confident and had high levels of optimism about the future relative to what they'd had for about a decade going into the election. Real wage increases were weak for a number of years, but were quite strong in the years leading up to the election. And of course, the unemployment rate was low and the rate of job creation was high. I've tried to read some of the political science literature that looks at populism across a range of countries. I think more commonly the evidence around cultural change and resistance to cultural change, I think, may explain more of this than the economic stuff. I think when it comes to economic, moreover, if it is economic policies, problems that are at the root of it, I'm a little bit worried about whether our policies will be able to solve it, and some of them might even exacerbate it. So let me try to tell you three things that I think are pretty difficult. One is not every problem has a villain. For our president, they do. The villain in some cases is Mexico. Some cases is Australia, Canada, all sorts of friends of ours. But the world isn't zero sum. There's a lot of gains from trade, and just because you have a problem doesn't mean someone else is at fault, or maybe even it's a robot or something that's not a person at fault. The second thing is not every problem has a comprehensive and full solution. If we adopted our full economic agenda, maybe we'd raise wages by 5% after 5 or 10 years. I think that'd be a pretty great thing. I don't know that it would transform our politics. Then the last thing that's a little bit awkward is if you look at the populist vote, it's not strictly correlated with income in a linear way. It's more of a U-shaped relationship. At the bottom, you tend not to support it, even just the strict working class. At the top, you tend not to. It's a little bit more like a petty bourgeois, as you'd call it in Europe. You own your, Joe the plumber, you own your plumbing company. The problem is some of what people have advocated of helping people with the transition, helping ease some of the costs associated with trade liberalization, would provide benefits to people at the bottom that would lead people sort of towards the middle to resent them, wonder why they would get them. Some of those benefits would go to immigrants, people of color, who knows what, and might actually increase some of the resentment that's fueling populism, even if it was exactly the right thing we should be doing to help ensure the gains were shared by everyone. The conclusion of that sort of nihilistic rant on my part is I would do everything you said. I would do it because it's the right thing by our economy. It would make us better off. I'm not sure it would solve our problems, and I'm not sure the best election campaign next time isn't going to be to make up some villain, claim that if we took on that villain, everyone in the country will have incomes twice as high, jobs tomorrow, vote for me.
Okay. Mexico. So there's one very obvious question, and then there's another question. The very obvious question is, what's the mood in Mexico? Is this administration, do they believe it's all going to settle down, or are people still very anxious about it? And secondly, what I think is a less obvious question, but to me in a way actually a more interesting question is, to what degree, because obviously your politics has been through many phases, to what degree has the politics of your part of the world been a test bed for a certain type of populism from which the region is now in retreat?
Well, thank you for your questions. And like Jason, I admire very much your initial statement. I'm just glad I didn't see it before I came here, because I would have said, well, that all is said and done, so might as well skip the panel. I think Latin America in general has been a hotbed of populism for a very long time. Mexico in particular suffered the consequences of that, and a few decades have passed. So I think we learned the lessons well. We've had, I would argue, pretty good policy for a long time. And maybe that's not such a great thing, because maybe we've forgotten maybe some of the harm that comes from populism. I think some other Latin American countries, like Brazil and Argentina, had more recent experiences and have therefore had a reinforcement to their inoculation to that kind of virus. But I may be wrong about it. I think.
What's the, if I can, sorry, forgive me interrupting. I mean, when you look at the situation now in Mexico, what reverberation has some of the rhetoric, certainly, around what has come from America? How's that played in your politics? I mean, what has been the reverberation in your politics?
I would say surprisingly little, because there is a long history of anti-American feelings in Mexico, deeply rooted in the 19th century. But over the past 20 years or so, Mexico and the US have forged a very deep integration. So many of the comments, the rhetoric coming out of the campaign were deeply offensive to Mexicans. And people have a lot of animosity towards that, but it has not taken shape as a political movement yet.
Right,
so I think
because it's sort of, you know, there was something very offensive. They thought, yeah, well, it just confirms my view.
Well, and I think it begs the question: why would the U.S. Yesterday, a business leader here at the conference was saying that one of the many blessings that the U.S. has is being surrounded by two oceans, in the east and west, and then north and south, peaceful, good neighbors. So picking fights with your neighbors doesn't seem like a great idea. And I think Mexico could react to that and could react badly. I think it has not happened yet, but we do have presidential elections next year. And the last thing I think that would be good for Mexico would be to have the election be about who can be the most anti-American.
Yeah.
It hasn't happened yet, but that is definitely a risk. And I think that is one of the inherent risks of populism. If you ask the question, is it a fad or is it something that's going to be here with us? And I think the answer has to be endogenous. Is it something that we need to fight? Is it something that we need to embrace? And I think the questions you posed are the ones that many policymakers have been posing. There's definitely legitimate grievances behind this. And we need to understand the grievances and maybe take seriously not only the grievances, but some of the proposals that have come out of this. But first we need to understand it. What is populism? You made a stab at trying to define it. I think it's when people pretend to represent the direct feelings of the common man. Normally, a common man that has been left behind. And there in the diagnosis, you start to see a problem and a danger. Also, if you start to define the common man as opposed to somebody else, maybe the elites, maybe immigrants, maybe refugees, or maybe just some other country, you start going down a slippery slope. And what is the risk? What is the risk? The risk is that this slippery slope will lead us to a very bad place. In that sense, I think it's something that we do need to fight. You were saying that you come up with something that is divisive. And I think the essence of populism is coming up with something that is easy to sell. And what is easy to sell, Jason mentioned it before, is blaming somebody else. Once you start down the blame game, that is very dangerous. So in essence, let me try to say this. Populism is, in essence, a failure of leadership. It's a failure of trying to provide real answers to the problems. It's going with the easy answer, and the easy answer is divisive. The easy answer is normally defined against an enemy. The easy answer is defined against somebody you can fight and confront. And it can be internal or external, but always against another. And defining the other as a minority, as an immigrant, as an elite, or defining the other as your neighbor, your friend, or somebody else around the world, has led us down that path to a very slippery slope of very dangerous things, both in terms of human rights and conflict. So let me not try to put the blame on populism itself. Let's just call it populism gone wrong. If we let populism become a failure of leadership, and if it becomes legitimate to embrace that failure of leadership and just to go along, let things happen, let the easy, divisive answers play a role in politics, that is what is really dangerous. And that is something to be fought, and that is something that we shouldn't let be entrenched. You were saying about a realignment. I think that's a rather benign thing to happen. If the left or the right can garner the popular sentiment and can tend to the needs of legitimate grievances, and that leads to a new political arrangement, that is a relatively benign one. But if we just continue to go down the path of what we know is bad policy, that will not help things, that has obviously no good end in sight. And it could be very painful, and it could take a long time before we learn the right lessons. I think some countries in Latin America right now are a prime example that you can go down that line for a long time doing harm before the body politic responds and things start to get
Pulls
fixed.
it back, yeah, for sure. Yascha, you've studied and written a lot about liberal democracy as a concept. To what degree do you think it's under threat from popular sentiment today? To what extent do you think that this generation of people feel less attached to these sort of fundamental liberal democratic precepts?
Yeah. Let me start with the public opinion piece, because that really is sort of shocking and surprising. So in my work, I look at how people's attitudes towards liberal democracy have changed over time. In the United States, when you ask people born in the 1930s and 1940s whether it's important to them to live in a democracy, over 2/3 of them say yes, really essential, 10 out of 10. Once you look at millennials born since 1980, less than 1/3 say the same. You can ask a bunch of different questions about whether they think liberal democracy is a good or a bad system of government. You get similar answers. Shockingly, even when you ask about alternatives to democracy, you wind up getting, low support, but much higher support than you would have done 20 years ago. So take a really extreme alternative to democracy, military rule. How many Americans now think that military rule or army rule is a good system of government? 20 years ago, it was 1 in 16, and today it is 1 in 6. Among young and affluent people, it's actually gone from 6% 20 years ago to 35% now. So I think there is a really radical transformation going on, and it does open the door to a form of populism. And I agree with you there, Luis, that sort of promises all the easy answers, right? What populists essentially say is, the world didn't quite give you what you hoped to get from it. And the reason is simple. Politicians are going to try and tell you that the reasons are complicated, that it's difficult to sustain rapid improvements in living standards, that it's difficult to figure out how to have an open economy that welcomes immigrants but still makes you feel like you have cultural ownership of your nation. But you know what? Actually, it's really simple. I have all of the answers, and all you need to do is for somebody who speaks common sense, stands up for the real people, which always excludes some people who are supposedly not the real people, to be elected into government, to fight for everybody, and everything will be solved. And of course, then those populists, and they do get elected, wind up being government and realizing, oh, you know what? Perhaps it's a little more complicated than I thought. Who knew? And what do they do at that point? They start to cast blame. They start to cast blame on their political opponents. They start to cast blame on the free press. They start to cast blame on independent judges. So they really undermine independent institutions, which are crucial to the success and the vibrancy of our societies.
I mean, one of the things that you find about government is that it's complex.
You should have given Donald Trump a call a couple of months ago. He might have been able to do that advice.
But it's you find, because it's I think it was Mario Cuomo who once said that you campaign in poetry, but you govern in prose, and this is certainly true. But one of the things that also interests me is, how do you explain quite complicated questions? I want to come with you, Jason, because it arose out of something you were saying earlier. How do you manage to, especially in an era of social media and kind of headline exchanges, you come to something like healthcare or education, it's really complicated. So how do you actually enhance the quality of the debate that you have with the people and explain the tough choices that there are in a way that people's eyes don't glaze over after 20 seconds?
In the political campaign, we didn't even try. There was one study that Paul Krugman likes to cite that we had a cumulative total of 32 minutes of coverage on the 3 main evening network news channels over all of 2016 of policy issues. This total amount. So we didn't even try there. But when you're governing, actually, you do more of that. And to give an example, there was an attempt to repeal and replace the Affordable Care Act. And the Congressional Budget Office came out with a study, and it said 24 million people would lose their health insurance. That was really easy to explain. That made all of the network news channels. The coverage it got wasn't political, who said it, who replied, who did this, who did that. It was actually substantive and policy-oriented, and that derailed the House's attempt to pass it. It's possible they'll be able to come back and pass it, I don't know, but the Senate won't pass it, it won't become the law of the land. So I think there are some things that do lend themselves to simplification, and in the simplification they actually catch the essence of what it's about and don't mislead. Other things are much tougher. You know, the debate over the Trans-Pacific Partnership, I thought we had a very strong argument. It took me about a minute to make the argument, though. And the argument was, this isn't about what you think about globalization. It's about how you want to manage globalization. This would add labor and environmental standards and state-owned enterprise rules and things that we don't have today to better level the playing field. And we'd lower other people's trade barriers more than our own, because we'd actually barely change anything in terms of our trade barriers, because we're already quite open. What was that, 30 seconds? Anyway, that persuaded, well, anyway, not enough people.
Yeah, I mean, Matthew, so you were saying earlier, which I think is right, that you had these two groups that came together.
Sure.
In order to succeed in Brexit. Once you, I mean, it's not quite the same concept, but it's sort of, once you actually come to the reality, it's a bit like come to the reality of government. What happens when those two groups find themselves in a different place? And one thing over and beyond that, which I'd be really interested in, is, do you think, I'll ask all the panelists, do you think that part of this populism is actually there are new political alliances that will arise out of it?
And when it comes to Brexit itself, I think after the vote on the 23rd of June, Britain could have gone down two paths. It could have gone down the closed Brexit path, which people like Nigel Farage were advocating, or it could go down the open Brexit path, which we're talking about at VoteLeave. And I'm pleased that Theresa May, so far, seems to be accepting the open Brexit path. So in her Lancaster House speech, she wants Britain to be a trading nation right across the world. I think that the government will accept the need for migration to the UK to keep the economy going. Whereas both of those things, I think, wouldn't have happened had it been sort of a more Nigel Farage type vision that had happened. But I think it comes down to thought leadership as well. And if you look at trade policy, going back to the point you were making before, I didn't follow the US presidential election as closely as you did, but I didn't hear Hillary Clinton making the case for the TPP or TTIP. To the contrary, she was also echoing some of those protectionist sentiments. So I think it's really important for all politicians, particularly on the trade front now, to really start battling those forces. In the UK, already, you're starting to see some stories in the papers about a US-UK trade deal, how it could be bad for GM foods coming to the UK, how it could mean American companies taking over the NHS. And I think we need to tackle these stories to try and make sure that we get trade.
Yeah. From the Mexican point of view, is it easy to make the case for globalization?
I think
you get pushback from it or not?
I think it's easier. Mexico is a very closed economy for a long time. And people, even though Mexico is a very young country, and most people do not remember that, their parents do, the opening up of Mexico actually had a huge impact on welfare and things that were very visible. So as opposed to, for example, the post-Soviet transitions, which were very painful, we had the pain before we started opening up. So the opening up of Mexico was visible and clearly good for the country. I think there's a very strong support for free trade in Mexico, even though people are not under no delusions. They don't think that the treaty has been wonderful and perfect and it's getting us a free lunch from the US. They understand it's good for policy, it's good for growth, it's related to their jobs. So they know it's important, but it's a much more clear-headed appreciation of the benefits of trade.
And is that a consensus now, or does the far left candidate still go against that?
I think it's a very broad consensus, surprisingly.
Right. And so the people say that, well, the issue for the government is how do you prepare people for it, rather than do you stop it?
I think that there's so many other issues in policy right now that trade is pretty much a consensus issue that is pretty much in the back burner.
Right.
It is coming to the forefront, not so much on the merits of policy itself, but on the bilateral relationship. How much should you tolerate the kind of stress you're having to the relationship?
Yascha, let me throw another subject into this, which is social media and its impact on all of this. To what degree does it influence the debate? To what degree does it make it harder to have rational debate, or is it actually a liberating and democratic thing?
You know, the metaphor that people always reach for is the invention of the printing press. And for a long time, I was a little skeptical of that. You know, the printing press was such a radical transformation of all of European, eventually world culture and politics. How can the internet be similar? But actually, in some ways, the printing press underplays the speed and the magnitude of a transformation. So about a dozen years into the invention of a printing press, you know, perhaps 500 human beings had ever held a printed press in their hands, and the technology had not left the city of Mainz. A decade into the invention of Facebook, the platform is available in every country of the world, except for a few places where the governments block it, and there's 2 billion daily active users. So it is a completely radical and quick transformation. And how do we make sense of what it is? I think there's sort of two things that are going on here, right? So what the printing press was the invention of one-to-many communication. For the first time, you could easily copy one set of ideas or texts and spread them to a lot of people, but it took a lot of capital, and it was relatively easy for governments to control. The first step of what the internet did was to democratize the promise of one-to-many communication. In 1992, to communicate to lots of people, you still needed to have control of the New York Times or CNN or something like that. Through the internet, you could make a website and reach everybody. Then what happened with social media is a shift from one-to-many communication to many-to-many communication. Now, if you're sitting on United Flight and you have 50 Twitter followers and the person next to you is reaccommodated, you can tweet a video of this, and you know, if 10 out of those 50 people retweet it, as they will, and you know, 10% of their followers retweet it, within an hour you've reached an audience of millions, right? So this is a radical transformation. How to make sense of the impact of that, I don't think is that populists will always gain from it. That's overly simple. But it really reduces the technological advantage that political, intellectual, and financial elites have over outsiders. Now, in dictatorships, that's a good thing, because it makes it much more difficult for dictators to control the political discourse. It makes it much easier for pro-democratic opposition forces to push against them. But in democracies, it does also empower people who are against the consensus, and that might be good and salutary in certain ways, but it can also be dangerous, because it does facilitate, you know, extremes and racists and.
But does it also diminish the quality of the debate? You know, sum up the policy options for North Korea in a tweet.
Yeah. Can I come in on this?
You can.
I remember the time when you were elected in '97, and there was lots of talk about how you were cheapening debate, and it was all about sound bites. And of course, it was the era of the 24-hour media really coming in. And you know, we were going through a transition whereby you needed rebuttal, you needed to be on top of the media, you needed to be feeding it all the time. I think it's simply the same as that. It's basically moving into a new era of media. And you know, yes, people on the so-called populist side, you know, the Leave campaign or Trump, were better at adapting to the new means of media. But I don't think you can put down the rise of it purely down to the new media. It's
No.
There's a political change.
And look,
as well.
one thing that's encouraging about the last election is the candidate who spent the most on the election, you know, wasn't the one that won in the primaries or in the general election. In this particular case, I would have rather it be something else. But as a general rule, I think that's quite refreshing, because there was a rather inexpensive way to directly reach people, to do it without mediation. I think as a general thing, that's good. I then have to decide whether I want to rethink that in light of the rather specific case here. But I think, I don't know, sort of hopeful-ish.
I think there's a slightly too simple assumption, therefore, because I don't think that both sides of the political spectrum profit equally when things are reduced into a 140-character tweet. besides for the reasons that we're talking about. It's easy to say in a tweet, terrible trade numbers, punish Mexico. It's difficult to explain in a tweet what the complicated reality behind free trade agreements are and why it is very valuable. I think it also goes
You can always
back to
take like the
something that
picture
you were
of your
saying earlier.
small print and tweet the picture of the small print.
Yeah,
Yeah, it
No,
may
but
not work.
it goes back to something that you were saying earlier as well, which is that I don't think it's as simple as saying, well, perhaps we on the sort of non-populist side should also run by finding an enemy and identifying him, and that way we'll get elected. We'll make a bunch of promises too, and we'll get elected. But if you want to actually keep the system of liberal democracy stable over time, that's not enough. For some people, it's enough to get elected once or twice, and they might get something out of it in one concrete way or a slightly more complicated way. And then the next person takes over, and they don't particularly care what comes after. Whereas if you want to actually keep the system stable and improve people's lives, it's not enough to get elected by making a bunch of wild promises, and then you disappoint those promises, and the problem comes back even more strongly. So I don't know that social media has the same impact on defenders of liberal democracy as it does on the people who are willing to gamble it away.
I'm going to throw it out to the audience in just a moment, but just before we come to that, one thing that I think whatever side of the spectrum we come from on this, we would all agree that it's important to get to the right answers, the best policy solutions on whatever the challenges facing, be it the United States, America, Mexico, wherever. To what extent does the very sort of partisan sharpness, the thing that I was describing, to what extent does that make it more difficult to kind of get to agreed solutions? One of the things I find is that it's quite difficult. I find it in the politics here, and I find it in the politics back home. It's quite difficult to get people now of different political parties to sit down and say, okay, let's put our heads together and find the right answer on this. Now, is one potential casualty of a very heightened sense of political debate around populism that people find it harder to work together across the political divide?
I think so. Just to take an example of the debate over taxes right now. We have a terrible, antiquated tax system, especially on the business side. It's not conducive to competitiveness. There's, I think, two ways to go on dealing with it. One is do the hard work of figuring out a real reform. A real reform would have winners and losers and trade-offs and be complicated, hard to put in a tweet. There's no way one political party could do that on its own. It would have a few defections from it. And the losers from the reform would retaliate against that political party and punish them. So the only way to do that is bipartisan. This administration made the judgment that they're not even going to try to go down that route. They would argue it was because the Democrats wouldn't cooperate. Doesn't matter why. Instead, they're going down a route of promising tax cuts to everyone. It's not fixing anything in our tax system. It's leaving it all intact. It's increasing the instability of it. And it's shifting the cost to the future in a non-transparent way where the gamblers won't get punished. So that would be a perfect example of a problem that lends itself, I think, to a really technocratic, bipartisan solution, but not one we're able to do right now.
And do you think, for example, if President Trump decided, okay, because obviously he's got the Freedom Caucus people on the other side of the spectrum, supposing he decided, right, I'm going to reach out to the Democrats, how easy would it be for the Democrats to respond?
I don't know, and I suspect we're never going to have that proposition tested. But, I'd like to think if he said, I want to do a real tax reform, it's not going to be regressive, it's not going to swell the deficit, and I'll throw some infrastructure in, there'd be a lot of Democrats. There's a lot of Democrats in the Senate who are facing a really tough race in states that President Trump won just a year and a half from now, so they'd have a real incentive to cooperate. So I think if you had gone that path, certainly if you'd gone that path from January 20th, it would have been, I think, an open door. I think even now it would probably be open enough.
So he could push it back open again. Matthew, have you got any thoughts from?
I do. Yeah. I mean, looking at it from a UK point of view, I think that the Labour Party's actually really missed out in the past year because it hasn't accepted the result of the referendum. So I think one reason why voters will, I think, reject it quite comprehensively at the election is because they don't listen to the Labour Party because it hasn't accepted the result of the referendum. So whatever it says on other policy issues, it almost hasn't got the permission to talk about it. A bit like the Conservatives after 97. They kept on looking back to the previous era of politics when it was Thatcher and Major, and it wasn't until David Cameron came along and accepted how you'd change things that they finally got permission to speak. So I think before you start building this sort of consensus, you have to start accepting the basic principles of what the public have said and actually listen to what they said in this case in the referendum.
I mean, but I think, you could, leave aside whether that's right or wrong for a moment. I mean, I think one thing, though, that is interesting to me is that if you run through many policy challenges, and Brexit is obviously a very big issue in many different ways, although, I understand completely what you're saying, and you may be right in what you're saying, I don't know. But it does seem to be that certain of the policy challenges, virtually whatever country you're in today, are not really left-right challenges. They're actual practical application of proper analysis and solutions.
I think there's a good point here. I want to come back to two things Jason said. I don't want to get into particulars of US tax policy, but at some point he said, well, you just push the costs into the future. No? I would call for thinking of it as a high discount rate. The future be damned, consequences be damned. Let's just do what's simple right now. And that, I think, is in many ways the essence of populism. Just consequences be damned at this moment. And that's exactly the thing that we should be afraid of. It's not a question of what is the right policy solution, is that we don't really care if it is a good policy solution as long as we're tending to the discontent.
Right, but at some point people find out, right?
Yeah.
Well, it might take a long time and it might be extremely painful for that to happen. And I want to get back to another thing Jason said, and I think it's very important. We've been talking about finding the right solutions and identifying the problems. And I think we're a long way from doing that. I mean, we've all spoken about income inequality, unemployment, productivity. And if you look at all those variables, and in particular since the financial crisis, some of them don't show the performance we would have liked. But they don't seem to relate very well to the rhetoric of everything is terrible, this world is terrible. But I think there's some policy variables that do respond to that rhetoric. And I think it has to do with not the distribution of income, not productivity, not employment, but the distribution of wealth. The impact that the global financial crisis had on the wealth of the poor people who actually had access to financial instruments, in the US in particular, but also in Europe, I think is something we've underappreciated, and that makes me more of a nihilist along with Furman. Maybe this is an even more complicated problem. Our policy solutions might not even fix productivity issues and employment levels and the evolution of the unemployment level, but if it's wealth, it's probably even more complicated than we thought.
We've only just got 10 minutes left for, thank you, we've only got 10 minutes left for questions from the audience. Just before we do that very shortly, Yascha, does this look different from Europe than it does from America to you, since you've been working in America but come from Europe?
I think there's some issues that are specific, right? So when you think about the challenges, say, around healthcare, obviously they're very different in the United States, when they're in Great Britain, and different Great Britain and the United States than continental Europe, just because the existing systems are so different. But the basic drivers, I think, are the same. And I think it's important not to think of these variables as too different. In some of the political science literature, they're sort of saying, okay, what exactly is a vote pattern today? And if it's this particular vote pattern, then it means it's about culture. And if it's that particular vote pattern, then it means it's around identity. But those things are going together and are surprisingly similar on both sides of the Atlantic. So on both sides of the Atlantic, you had a post-war era in which you just had these radical improvements of living standards, so that people really, their life world was just transformed from when they were kids. When they were 5 and when they were 30 or 35, the kind of access to material goods they had, the life expectancy, the social status had just changed radically. And we can't offer people that at the moment. And that drives a lot of the other things we're seeing. When people today are saying, I'm pissed off with the immigrants who are coming in, I have trouble accepting the sort of slow transformation in Europe of mono-ethnic, monocultural countries into multi-ethnic, multi-religious ones, or in the United States of a country that's always been multi-ethnic but had a strict racial hierarchy in a country where that racial hierarchy, thankfully, day by day is becoming a little less strong. That is in part driven by those economic factors. Because when you feel like it's zero sum, and the person over there doing well means that something's being taken out of your pocket, you're much more tempted to go in for that kind of anger against outgroups than if you are feeling that everybody's boat is lifting. And so I think we need to look at the data carefully there, but not with a simplistic mind frame. We have to think about what the background conditions are that are sort of common to all voters and to many different countries at the same time.
Thank you. So we've got just a few minutes left for 1 or 2 questions that we have from the audience. Yascha, and then the gentleman there. And we've got a microphone coming, I think.
Thank you, sir. I apologize. I've already started to lose my voice today. One of the things that is in the crosshairs of populism, in my opinion, is everything that was built in the ashes of World War II. I don't really understand why that is. Why is NATO on the chopping block? Why is the UN on the chopping block? Bretton Woods institutions. These are things designed to keep us away from going to war, but yet those are the first things to go in this movement. I was curious if you all had the same sentiment. If so, why or why not? Thank you.
Who wants to start?
I mean, I think part of it is, let me say I agree with you completely, agree completely with the premise of your question. I think some of it comes from overrating American power. We're a really powerful, important country, the most powerful and important in the world, but we're 1/4 of the global economy. We're about that fraction of the world's military might. And so when it comes to dealing with China, for example, there's a choice. Do we incorporate them into our institutions, into the rules that have worked well for us and the rest of the world? Or do we try to exclude them and lead them to set up their own institutions and their own structure for the world? And I think if we overrate our power and our leverage, it will drive others to develop alternative arrangements that will exclude us, won't be done with the same benefits that we've gotten, because all these institutions you named, or almost all of them at least, we helped create all of them, and most of them are based here in the United States, and all of them serve us well.
I think it's interesting how the rhetoric of the campaign in the US presidential election is different to what's actually happening. So take NATO, for example. Donald Trump almost sounded like he was going to walk out of NATO the first day he was in office. But in fact, he seems to have come round to it and is really insisting that countries step up to the mark on the 2% point. Look at NAFTA again. It sounded like from the campaign he was going to rip up the agreement on day one. Whereas now it seems to be more of a renegotiation and a tinkering. So I think things are changing in a good direction.
I always try to figure out why is it that young people seem to be less invested in the system than older people, and especially around those values of liberal democracy and the international institutions in which they are embedded. And I do think it has something to do, and this is sometimes offered as a sort of deflationary account, but we don't have to be so worried, because all it is that young people don't quite understand what the alternative would mean. It's not that they really like the idea of giving up on democracy or of ripping up over the whole international order. It's that they can't quite imagine what it would be like. And I think there is something to that, but that's really dangerous, because once you've ripped up the global international order, it'll be really difficult to stitch back together. So I do think that a lot of what's driving it is a lack of understanding of what that system is, what our own values are, why we profit from them. And I think it's the task of everybody in this room, and I say this to academic audiences too, and they're much more taken aback than any of you will be, I think. It's the task of all of us who care about this system to go out and proselytize for it. We've become far too complacent in pointing out just the problems of a status quo, and there's plenty of problems, and there's things where we need to improve and reform upon, without a doubt. But we also need to make the case for what our values are and why we care for them and why we want to fight for these things. And we haven't done that in the last 20 or 30 years. The institution where I teach has no purpose. Harvard University has no mission. As an institution, there's individuals within it who do great work, and it produces all kinds of great research, but there's no sense of common mission to educate citizens who are actually going to defend the things we care about in our political system, and that has to change.
Yeah, I mean, I think maybe what the new populism will do is force us actually to make that defense. Though I also think we have reached a point where most of these institutions, and I would say this very strongly about Europe, also require some fundamental reform. We've got time for one last question. Yes, sir. And then we're
So I guess my question is almost a follow-on to what you were talking about, which is obviously there seems to be a consensus about we have large challenges which are only going to get bigger in the future because of structural changes, but there are challenges ahead. I'm taking the UK as an example, who do you personally believe, or which institutions and organisations do you actually believe are set up to deal with these challenges? And if the current institutions and organisations aren't, what is going to replace them, and who is going to help make some of these cases?
right. I'm going to pass that on to Mexico. I'm going to frame it in this way, because one of the things I do think that politics raises today is government itself and how it's reformed and how the institutions of government are made much more effective. Since I think one big part of this is actually great frustration with the way the government works. Just as a last set of remarks, if you could choose one thing which would allow us to make governments themselves more effective institutionally at dealing with the challenges we have ahead, what would it be? We'll start with you, Louise, because you're in government, and the rest of us
Can say what we want.
Actually, I'll take that from Jason and allow him to answer since he's not in government anymore.
You go first, and then Louise can think.
I don't know. I mean, I think the press is doing a pretty good job. I think there's, in some ways, a lot more factual, data-oriented, analytic journalism in the area of economics than there's ever been before. I think, this gets to the very narrow, not the defense of democracy, but something like the Congressional Budget Office that did that study on the 24 million uninsured, and it's largely unquestioned, and you have the Institute of Fiscal Studies that plays a bit of a similar role. In the UK, I think things like this that you invent, you don't imagine how important they're going to be, and they become in a fact-free world, the referees that people live by have changed the way I think policy is done in the areas I care about.
Matthew?
It's a tough one, that. I think it's really important to have an opposition, and I actually think it's sad that in the UK the opposition hasn't been more effective in some ways. I think Theresa May will get in with a huge majority, which I'm personally quite pleased about. But I think for a government to be sharp, for it to be accountable and responsive to the wants and desires of people, it does need that alternative power base there, which is capable of challenging the next election. You're holding it to account.
Yascha?
I think there's a really fundamental tension that we have to deal with. And that's that on the one hand, policy challenges have become technically more complex and require more international cooperation. Just think of a topic like climate change. And so that's driving government towards more and more of what I would call undemocratic liberalism, a form where the policy we make actually makes sense and is mostly sort of more or less right, but is really insulated from popular input. And on the other side, you get this counter-reaction against it, where people say, I feel really excluded from the political process, and I just want somebody to go in there and break some things. And how to make people feel heard, but while preserving the space for the relevant international cooperation and expertise to happen in areas where it's necessary, from free trade to things like climate change, I think is the great challenge of the next 50 years. And I've sort of punted because I haven't answered what actually to do, but that's how I think about the nature of a question.
Thank you. Now, Louise.
I think as policymakers, we're always tempted to think of a structural change that will make things better when the problem is really complicated. I think right now, we just need to fight the good fight. And I think there's two ways of seeing this. Just a vision of wanting to get things done, which is what I've heard in many of the panels here today, and an attitude of just blowing things up. And I think you need to fight the good fight and understand things and wanting to get things done, and rejecting that view of blowing things up might be just pleasant and will get us through the next year and will get us through the next election.
It's perfect. We've actually finished absolutely
Bang on time.
So thank you all very, very much for attending the panel, and thank you guys for participating.